Venice sits just off the northeast coast of Italy at the top of the Adriatic Sea. It's the only city in the world that was built entirely on water. It consists of over 100 islands connected by bridges and canals. During the 5th century, Attila the Hun, a generally annoying individual, and his Mongol hordes were moving down the east coast of Italy, destroying everyone and everything they encountered. Some of the people who were in Attila's direct line of march decided that it might be a good idea to get out of town, and so they migrated across the lagoon to a group of islands. Their bet was that Attila was having such a great time sacking and looting and burning and taking slaves that he'd never bother to follow them across the water. And you know what? They were right. Their islands had virtually no land for farming, but they were perfectly suited to become a center for trading. The Venetians soon realized that the future success of their community rested in their ability to buy luxury goods in the east and sell them to rich people in the west. And apparently, that is still going on. Because there was no farmland, there was no feudal system of landowners and serfs. The nobles were merchants who commanded a fleet of ships to bring stuff to Venice. Everyone in the city was bound together like the crew of a ship. You could inherit money and property, but positions of political importance came by election, and there was constant competition among the important families. The Christian world had been divided in half. The western part was centered in Rome. The eastern part was centered in Constantinople, which was also known as Byzantium. Venice was part of the Eastern Church in Constantinople, but physically it was right down the road from Rome, so it was in an ideal spot to control the trade between the two empires. The primary trade was in spices: pepper, ginger, cardamom, clove, cinnamon, and sugar. Sugar was often considered a medicine, but the others had almost no nutritional significance. However, they were a sign of social status and the first example of an ideal item for long-distance international trade. They were lightweight and not very bulky. You could get a lot into a small space. They were extremely expensive, and they had an almost indefinite shelf life. For over 500 years, until the early 1500s, Venice was the commercial center of the world, and the Venice you see today is the result of those 500 years of outstanding power and wealth. I had been to Venice a number of times as a tourist, but things are very different when you come with a film crew. You need to know a great deal about the history of the place, what would make an interesting story, and how you can get that story. You need special permits and official contacts. Venice is even more complicated for a film crew because whenever you want to get from one place to another, you need a boat. To make sure I had the best visit possible, I teamed up with Steve Perillo. Steve is the third generation of a family that specializes in bringing American tourists to Italy.
My grandfather started Perillo Tours in 1945 with a $300 Remington typewriter in the Bronx.
Amazing.
And it was right after the war, so the main services was helping the immigrants and their relatives back home in Italy, sending packages back and forth, eventually selling steamship tickets. And pretty soon my father took over, and it was 747s back and forth to Italy, and now we're in the travel business.
Eventually, they ended up with America's largest travel company devoted to Italy. This is the first of a series of programs in which Steve and I travel around Italy. And we try to plan the program so you could take the same trip as we did. In Venice, our first stop was St. Mark's Square. For centuries, St. Mark's Square has been the social, religious, and political center of the city. In 1496, Bellini painted the procession in the Piazza San Marco. Over the years, it's become the most reproduced view of the city. And as you can see, the view has remained pretty much the same. The most important buildings in Venice surround the square. The Palace of the Duke of Venice, called the Doge, the Basilica of San Marco, the main administrative buildings, and the two most visited coffee houses in town. Let's start with the oldest coffee house. Most great cities have a historically famous coffee house. Rome has Cafe Greco, Paris has Du Magot, Vienna has the Soccer, Seattle has a Starbucks, and Venice has Florian's. The first coffee beans reached Venice in 1638, but it took almost 100 years before it became a popular drink. The problem was coffee's bad reputation. Rumors from Constantinople claimed that coffee incited women to lascivious behavior. It was pretty bad for women.
It was worse for men. They suffered a loss of virility, weakening of character, and they were even talking about overthrowing the government.
Well, eventually most of those rumors were proved false, with the possible exception of the ladies running around more, because they were running around so much to begin with, no one could determine whether coffee had an effect. And you must keep in mind, this was Casanova's hometown.
Let's try this coffee.
I'm going to need a double. Florian's opened in 1720. The interior you see now dates to the 1850s. For almost 300 years, the thing to do was sit out in front, be serenaded by the orchestra, and have a coffee, a hot chocolate, or a glass of sparkling wine. For centuries, the most powerful person in Venice was known as the Doge, and this was his palace. He was the chief magistrate and senior elected official of Venice, and he was selected because the local aristocracy considered him to be the smartest guy in town. Imagine a society that elected their highest official because he was the most intelligent person in the country. What an extraordinary idea. But the powers of the Doge were strictly limited. There were a series of checks and balances that prevented any single individual from taking control. And if someone tried to take over, they could easily wake up dead. During the 1300s, architects shifted their focus away from churches to more secular buildings. They wanted to build town halls and universities and private homes and bridges and pizza parlors. One of the finest examples of this change is the Doge's Palace. It was begun at a time when the power and the wealth of the city were at their height. In spite of an enormous amount of ornament, it presents an image of authority and grandeur, and it was never involved in a subprime mortgage. The most impressive building on the square is St. Mark's Basilica, which was the Doge's private chapel. In 1071, the Doge asked the powerful merchants to do him a small favor. He pointed out that since they were already sailing around the ports of the eastern Mediterranean, it would be nice if they could stop for a minute and pick up some rare marble and some semi-precious stones and a few sculptures and stuff like that, so he could decorate his chapel. Just the basics. And that is exactly what they did. Of course, the people in the eastern Mediterranean felt their treasures were being looted, but you just can't please everybody all the time. The basilica was modeled on the Byzantine churches of Constantinople and designed as a status symbol of Venice's wealth and power. St. Mark was the author of the Gospel of Mark and the creator of the Church of Alexandria in Egypt. He's generally considered to be the founder of Christianity in Africa. His feast day is April 25th, his symbol is the lion, and he is the patron saint of Venice. Tradition holds that it was to St. Mark's home that the disciples came after the death of Jesus, and where Jesus came after his resurrection. There's also a theory that the Last Supper was held in St. Mark's mother's home. Now, there's no proof of this in either the New Testament or church history, but the belief is widely held. In 68 AD, the pagan residents of Alexandria were so infuriated by Mark's efforts to turn them away from their traditional gods, they tied a rope around his neck and dragged him through the streets until he died. In 828, two Venetian merchants who were doing business in Alexandria heard that the Muslim rulers of the city had decided to cleanse the town of all references to Christianity, and they were going to destroy the body of St. Mark in the temple where it had been preserved. So the two guys secretly stole the body and took it back to Venice. The basilica was built to house the relics. Outside the basilica, there is a mosaic that shows the two merchants covering the relics with a layer of pork. Since Muslims are not allowed to touch pork, this was an ideal way to prevent them from discovering the relics. When the relics got to Venice, they were hidden while the new basilica was being built. When it came time to install the relics in the basilica, no one could remember where they had been hidden. Everyone in Venice came to the basilica and prayed for the recovery of the relics. Then in 1094, St. Mark extended a hand from a column and indicated where his remains were, at which point they were removed and placed into a sarcophagus. The Campanella is St. Mark's freestanding bell tower. The original structure was built in 1514. The tower is over 300 feet high. You can reach the top using the stairs, or if you agree that discretion is the better part of valor, you can join Steve and me in the elevator. From the top, there's a great view of the city and the lagoon. One of the things you might notice as you look down is that the domes of the basilica appear much higher outside than they do inside. And this is actually the case. At one point, the new buildings in Venice were getting higher than the domes of the church, which was not good for the Doge's image. So he had a set of false tops put on, which keep his domes higher than the other domes. Remember that until the 1800s, the basilica was the Doge's private church. These were a form of ego implants.
The bells in the tower signaled the people. One signal might be for the senators to meet. Another might be that the fleet was coming in.
Or the arrival of a soft ice cream truck. There are three ways for a tourist to get around the waters of Venice. Public transportation is provided by water buses called vaporati. The stops are clearly marked, and it's the easiest and least expensive way to get around. There are also private water taxis that will get you where you want to go, fast or slow. It's your call. They'll also take you on a private tour of the city. Finally, you can explore the canals in a gondola. The gondola got its present form during the 1600s. They're made from 8 different woods and coated with 10 layers of black paint. The top of the metal prow at the front is said to symbolize the hat of the Doge, and the 6 forward prongs represent the 6 districts of Venice. Only a native Venetian can become a gondolier, and the job is usually passed from father to son. The price of a gondola ride will vary with your request. The least expensive is a simple tour along the Grand Canal. If you want a detailed historical description of the buildings, the price goes up. And there's another increase for singing. Which may or may not be worth the price, depending on who's singing. The banks of the Grand Canal are lined with more than 170 buildings that date from the 13th to the 18th century and demonstrate the wealth, power, and artistic talents of the Republic of Venice.
This is the Grand Canal, and Grand Canal is the more important waterway in Venice, and one of the more beautiful streets.
How deep is this? How deep is this water?
Here it's going to be 4-5 meters. On Canal Grande, there are the more important palaces of the city.
Private palaces.
Private palaces, or they could be palace that host the office of Italian government.
Offices.
In front of us, we can see the bridge of Accademia. It's one of the 4 bridges that exist on Canal Grande. You know that Canal Grande divides Venice into big parts. All the Italians laugh at the Venetian because they said they first learn to drive a boat and then they learn to walk.
Oh, this is the Rialto Bridge?
Yes. Rialto maybe derives from the word rivus altus, that means high bulwark, or another version is deep river. This one was the first place where people settled, moving from the mainland in the 5th or 7th century.
When was that built, the Rialto Bridge?
The last bridge, the bridge in marble, was built in 1592. You have to imagine that in the past, the water space was much more wider. Without a boat, you couldn't live in Venice. Then, during the century, they reinforced the shore, they built the bulwark, they built palaces. Sometimes they fulfilled canals. That's why sometimes you can see the name of the street, Rio Terra. It means river fulfilled, terra, terra, interrato.
So the story of Venice is the story of water.
Absolutely. You cannot divide Venetian from water.
That's great. Hey, thanks for the ride.
No problem. While we were in Venice, we stayed at the Western Europa and Regina Hotel. 5 buildings dating from the 1700s and 1800s were joined together to create the property. The oldest of the buildings was a palace belonging to the family of the Tiepolos. 2 of the Doges were Tiepolos, but the most famous was Giambattista Tiepolo, who was one of the greatest Venetian painters of the 1600s. Many of the rooms look out across the canal at the Church of La Salute. By the middle of the 1800s, some of the buildings had been turned into a hotel. Claude Monet, the Impressionist painter, stayed here because of the great views. Another of the hotel buildings was the theater, which hosted the first performance of the first opera composed by Rossini. It was also the place where in 1896, the people of Venice saw their first movie. It was a film produced by the Lumiere brothers, who were the original guys into the business. The strength of their work lay in the fact that people moved. The boys were a little weak on storyline. It opens with a dramatic scene of people leaving a factory, then people leaving a ship, then people getting onto a train. Getting on as opposed to getting off was a dramatic plot change. At that point, they discovered comedy based on a squirting hose. There was a scene where people played cards, and then the great finale when a house was demolished. I heard that a major Hollywood studio is planning to remake this film. Much to their credit, the management of the hotel has maintained the feeling of the old palaces. The hotel is also fortunate in having an extremely talented chef who is serious about his work. He runs the kitchen, but he also does all the shopping. One of the elements I use to judge a hotel is the quality of their breakfast buffet. Most nutritionists agree that breakfast is the most important meal of the day, and apparently the director of food and beverage here agrees. Of all the markets in Venice, the best known is the Rialto Market. It dates back to 1097 and has been a constant source of fresh produce and fish for centuries, and it is open to the public. It's an ideal place to see what the people of Venice eat and to pick up some fresh fruits to snack on. At about noon, the market closes, and many of the merchants stop into one of the nearby baccarii, which is a lot like a tapas bar in Spain. There's a big bar, all the food is on it. You pick out what you want, you eat it, and you pay up.
And they always have wonderful wine by the glass.
Wine by the glass. We'll have two.
Let's have some.
There's a long bar with lots of small dishes. Spicy meatballs, artichoke hearts, teeny sandwiches, grilled vegetables, mashed codfish and garlic, and small glasses of local wine. You eat and drink what you want. When you finish, you tell the owner what you had, pay up, and you're on your way. Good, fast, easy, and inexpensive. For us, it was a perfect spot. Such a cool place.
Yeah.
Wish we had the same thing in America. During the Renaissance, the painters of Florence and the painters of Venice had very different approaches to their work. The painters in Florence were more interested in drawing than color. They used perspective and composition to produce a unified pattern. Color was something that came after. For the painters of Venice, color was the main focus of their work. One of the most famous Venetian painters of the 15th century was Titian. And you can see one of his great works, the Madonna with saints and members of the Pissarro family, in the Basilica di Santa Maria Gloriosa di Frari. That's about as close as I can get to the real pronunciation, but tell them you're looking for the Titian and they'll bring you to the right place. He moved the Holy Virgin out of the center. Outrageous. He broke up the balance between St. Francis and St. Peter. Very dangerous. There had been a tradition of putting in the guys who paid for the painting, but in this case, Titian does it in an entirely new way. The painting was a statement of thanks for a victory by one of the Pissarros over the Turks. Pissarro is kneeling in front of the Virgin. Behind him is a soldier in armor, holding a flag and dragging a Turkish prisoner. On the other side of the picture, St. Francis brings the other members of the family to the attention of the Madonna. The painting was successful because Titian used light and color to bring balance to a very unusual composition. Having a flag balance the figure of the Holy Virgin was unheard of, but the rich colors make it work.
This entire program can be seen, and a free printable copy of the show transcript can be downloaded from burtwolf.com.